You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
David R. Dowd.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. We've got a fantastic show for you today. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about a couple of sponsors who make the show possible each and every day. Craig Allenson has a brand new book. It's a spinoff of the Expeditionary Force series, Expeditionary Force Mavericks, Book 1, Death Trap. The human soldiers stranded on the planet Paradise have been recruited into an alien legion to do the dirty jobs that the high-tech species won't do. Their first mission is to kick the enemy off a backwater planet no one cares about. It's a simple assignment, except everyone has a hidden agenda, and the planet could become a death trap. Craig Allenson's brand new book, Death Trap. Also thanks to Ernie Lindsay with his Sarah series, the psychological thriller series that begins with Sarah, has books 1 through 3 and a bonus novella, Single Mother, Successful Executive, Target for Revenge. The psychological thriller series box set Sarah Winthrop's world is thrown headlong into a whirlwind of chaos, along with her family, friends, and colleagues, by unseen enemies seeking revenge. Those lurking in the shadows, clawing for vengeance, will go to any lengths. Any lengths. It's likely never occurred to them that they may have just messed with the wrong woman. The Sarah series, books 1 through 3 and a bonus novella by Ernie Lindsay. Also, John L. Monk with the Jenkins Cycle. From Book 1, Kick, a supernatural thriller. They say suicides are damned for eternity, but if possessing the bodies of violent criminals is hell, then Dan Jenkins will take it, and he does, every time a portal arrives to whisk him from his ghostly exile. Normally, before the villain returns to kick him out, Dan dishes out a final serving of justice and leaves the world a safer place. It's one of the rules if he wants more rides, and he's happy to oblige. For a part-time dead guy, it's a pretty good gig. And then he meets her. Kick is the first book in a series of supernatural thrillers. If you like Quantum Leap and Everyday, you'll love this gritty and original take on the body-hopping hero story. Vividly written, Kick is a wild ride with a sharp, sarcastic wit and a flawed, yet likable main character. From John L. Monk, The Jenkins Cycle, Book 1, Kick. And from M.D. Massey, Invasion, Zombie Apocalypse. The action-packed first novel in M.D. Massey's Them Zombie Apocalypse series. When a surprise nuclear attack forces Aiden from hiding, he finds the world to be a much different place and more deadly. Now he'll traverse a post-apocalyptic landscape populated by violent redneck looters, rogue military factions, and an army of hungry undead. After 2 combat tours in the Middle East, Aiden Sullivan just wants to be left alone on his family's ranch in the Texas Hill Country. But when the bombs fall and the dead walk, Aiden risks life and limb to rescue his aging parents from the zombie horde. To save them, he'll traverse half the state of Texas while fighting rogue military units, violent redneck looters, and thousands of walking dead. The question is, can he make it there in time? Only one thing's for sure, this ranger will complete the mission or he'll die trying. M.D. Massey's Invasion, Zombie Apocalypse. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have David Dow on the show with me today. David's brand new book called Confessions of an Innocent Man is one of the most gripping and one of the best novels I've read this year. Welcome to the show, David.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
David, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
My first memory of wanting to be a writer was when I was in college, and I drifted around. I started as a math major, then I was a philosophy major, but I ended up as a history major. And I found that the history that I really loved reading was the history that wasn't just a recitation of names and dates, but that was actually a story. And so I remember sitting in a seminar in my junior year of college, and it was a seminar on the Protestant Reformation, which I took not because I had any great interest in the Protestant Reformation, but because I loved the professor, and my philosophy was, I'm going to take classes from the professor no matter what they teach. And we were reading this book that was just a masterful piece of storytelling. And I thought, I want to be able to tell stories one day as well as this book is doing.
My oldest son is a first-year English teacher this year, and we were having a conversation the other day that he might want to switch to teach history because as he's interacting with these kids, he realizes that the way that we generally teach history is all wrong. If we couch it in story, those are things that we remember, and that's amazing that you had a similar experience. Was there something in particular that really captured your imagination? I know you were studying the Protestant Reformation, but did a story start forming in you during this time?
The story that started forming in me actually was a story that I ended up pursuing when I went to graduate school. I went to graduate school thinking I was going to be a history teacher before I went to law school. And what I studied when I was in graduate school was American intellectual history from the end of the 18th century until about the middle of the 19th century. But what I was particularly interested in was how you could have these giant political thinkers in the United States who were doing something that had never been done before, which was the creation of this Constitution that was an entirely new form of government. And I was just fascinated by how they could be doing that at the same time that they were owning slaves. And so I thought about how it would be possible to write a story about their individual lives that tried to make sense of how they could hold those completely opposite ideas in their head at the same time. Those opposite ideas being, on the one hand, this idea of liberty and equality, and on the other hand, this idea that it's okay for white people to own black people. And so those were really the first concrete stories that I thought myself about trying to write. And then I read stories like that while I was in graduate school and wrote my thesis about that while I was in graduate school. And then obviously ended up drifting into law school and becoming interested in a different type of story. But that was the first story that I myself thought, this is a story I want to write.
Fantastic. What drew you to the law, to study law?
What drew me to the law was that while I was in graduate school, working, as I said, on this period from the formation of the country really to the Civil War, I took a class at the law school, which was down the street from the graduate school, because it was relevant to my history thesis. And I sat in that class and I thought to myself, oh, wow, this is what I really want to be doing. It was a class of constitutional theory. And so it was not just about slavery and inequality, but it was about the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. And I thought, this is just something that will always be exciting to me. And so I eventually moved from history to law, still not thinking that I was going to become a practicing lawyer or law professor, but just because I was interested in constitutional theory. And then I graduated from law school and did what most law school graduates do, which is to practice law for a while, but then was not feeling the satisfaction from that, and so drifted back into legal teaching, which is where I am to this day.
You also are involved in representing people that are that may be involved in cases that are complex and maybe cases that a lot of people don't want anything to do with. Is that right?
I am, and that started yes, I am, and that started entirely by accident, I should say. I have a team that works with me, and everybody who I've ever hired to work on my team has been somebody who probably going all the way back to when she or he was in law school, wanted to represent death row inmates. And that was not how I came to this line of work at all. What happened to me was that I was teaching a class at the law school, and a little tiny corner of that class had to do with the death penalty. I mean, a little tiny corner. And I decided I would understand that corner a little bit better if I knew more about the death penalty and more about death row. And so a friend of mine was, in fact, a death penalty lawyer, and I asked him if I could go with him one day to death row in Texas. And so I did. And I saw death row. I met a bunch of death row inmates. And then he asked me if I wanted to represent one of these guys who I had just met, who was scheduled to be executed in 2 weeks' time from the day that I met him. And I said to my friend, I don't think so. In the first place, I'm not really against the death penalty. And in the second place, I don't have any idea what I'm doing. I've never done a death penalty case before. When I was practicing law, I was a commercial lawyer. And my friend said to me, you might not know what you're doing, but you have access to a computer and a law library, which means that you'll be better at it than he will. And really, your views about the death penalty shouldn't matter. All that should matter is that the guy doesn't have a lawyer. And that was a powerful argument to me. Back in that day, guys on death row did not have a right to have a lawyer. So this death row inmate was entirely dependent on a volunteer to represent him. And it's true that I wasn't against the death penalty, but I also was definitely not in favor of the state executing people who didn't have representation. So I agreed to work on that case, and what can I say? I found it satisfying. I found it satisfying both intellectually and emotionally, and one led to two, and two led to four, and all of a sudden you wake up as a middle-aged guy and you become a death penalty lawyer. So that was how I went down the road to that. And in the course of building that clinic to represent these guys on death row, I eventually started hiring people, and everybody, as I said, who I've hired has been somebody who applies for the job knowing that she or he wants to be a death penalty lawyer. So it's an interesting office that I have, because the younger lawyers are people who have known from day one that they're against the death penalty and that they wanted to work in that space. And the head of the office, or at least the senior person in the office, which is me, is the only person in the office who got into the line of work by accident.
Wow. Just like your observation about history, that the best history and the history that sticks with you is when that is couched in a story, and we can connect with people and not just look at it as a bullet list of events that happened just in a vacuum. That when it's attached to people and stories that we can feel, then the history becomes part of us. In the same way that fiction can have a similar effect in changing how we see people and see events, a lot like your book, Confessions of an Innocent Man, does. Also, in the last few years, especially, there have been a lot of documentary films made. Netflix has this wildly popular series, Making a Murderer. I remember there being a documentary series about the West Memphis Three. I forget the title of that series. But those types of things help us connect to a specific person, a specific event, and then it humanizes them. Fiction has a similar power. Although we're connecting with fictional characters, we come to get to know them in the book, and then our eyes are kind of open to bigger picture things. What was the experience for you that started changing the way you look at the death penalty and some of these, situations that we think we are cut and dry, black and white about, but a lot of times are more nuanced?
You put your finger right on it, and it's the storytelling. And I tell people that what really made me against the death penalty was that I had this human moment. And what I mean by human moment is that I had this moment where I began to realize that my clients had their own stories. And those stories included moms and dads and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles, and often sons and daughters and spouses or significant others, and that you can't understand somebody at all, including people in prison and including especially people on death row without understanding their entire story. And so a lot of what death penalty lawyers do in order to try to prevail in the cases where they're representing their clients is to tell their client's story and to show people, whether it's a jury or a judge or the governor or the board of pardons and paroles who have you, that this is a person who did a horrible human thing, because most of these guys did a horrible human thing. They killed somebody. But that is part of a richer, fuller, more complete story, and that you can't really understand this person without having some insight into that larger story. And so I tried to do that actually in two of my earlier books, two of my memoirs, where I would try to tell stories about some of my clients. And I ran into some limitations in writing those memoirs because I have a duty of confidentiality that continues even after my representation of a client has ended and even after my client has been executed. And so I really felt like writing a novel would be a way to continue this road that I was down of writing these stories about people in the criminal justice system, people on death row in particular, without laboring under the constraint of having to have it be almost a version of a biography of somebody on death row. And so I'm in complete agreement with you, Hank, that the way to reach people is by telling stories. And at least in my case, I tried to tell the stories in one format with my last two books and now in a different format with this book.
I think a lot of people's hesitation to want to think about this topic more broadly. Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, we say we want justice. A lot of times what we really want is vengeance. And we don't quite understand what justice means. But we want to be able to sleep at night. I've raised children and I don't want to think that some heinous crime is going unpunished. And by unpunished, I mean that they're locked away and not able to do this again. How do you start parsing out these fears that we all have when you're representing someone on death row?
Yes. My wife and I have one son. He's a senior in high school. He's going off to college next year. And so I think about the exact same things. And I don't really know that it's ever possible to conquer the fear that something bad might happen to those you love, whether it's a father or a mother worrying about their children, or for that matter, a son or a daughter worrying about their parent or their friend or what have you. I think that what I've tried to do in my own life, and I don't know if this is an answer to your question, and I don't know if it's a solution even, but what I've tried to do in my own life is to think about what can the criminal justice system do? What can society do that is going to keep me safer than the alternatives? I recognize that nothing can keep me perfectly safe. Nothing, can guarantee that I or my loved ones will be safe. And so the question is, what is going to do the best job? Not what's going to do the perfect job, what's going to do the best job. And I think that the best job that society can do is to correctly identify the people who do something wrong and then put them somewhere where they're not going to be able to do anything that injures us. And what that means is that there are two pieces of that. When the criminal justice system identifies the wrong person and sends the wrong person to prison, we very commonly, and for good reason, focus on the fact that there's an innocent person in prison. Whenever you read a story about an exoneration, it's all about the horrible ordeal that the innocent person has suffered in prison. And I think that it's appropriate for us to be mindful of that. But the part of the story that gets overlooked is that the state has not only failed that person by putting somebody in prison who shouldn't have been there, but the state has also failed all of the rest of us too. Because the state's duty is to keep us safe And when the state puts the wrong person in jail or prison, it hasn't kept us safe. It's left the bad guy actually out there. And so the way I think about these criminal justice issues and the balance of retribution and vengeance with the desire to be safe and keep us safe is by focusing on both halves of that equation and saying the state has a duty to keep me safe, but that means that the state has to get the right guy. And then once the state has the right guy, it keeps me safe by keeping the person in prison. It doesn't have to do more than that. There's this little strand of Eighth Amendment law. The Eighth Amendment is the provision in the Constitution that prohibits the state from inflicting cruel and unusual punishment. And so people have disagreed for 100 years about whether that means the death penalty is unconstitutional. But the part of that amendment that people don't disagree about is that one thing that makes a punishment cruel and unusual is if it is more than necessary. So just for example, even if you say the death penalty is okay constitutionally, that doesn't mean that you can kill somebody by drawing and quartering him, because that would be more than is necessary to kill him. It's excessive. And so my view now, it hasn't always been this way, but my view now is that the death penalty as a whole is excessive in the same way that drawing and quartering somebody would be, because we don't need to do that to keep the rest of us safe. We can put somebody in prison for the rest of his life and we're going to be safe. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who killed a lot of people, is never going to be executed because he's serving a life sentence, but he's also never going to kill anybody else again because he's never going to get out of prison. And I think that we can treat ordinary murderers the same way that we treat Ted Kaczynski and keep society safe by just keeping them out of society.
Right. So all of those are heady topics that we can discuss all day, and we can come down on one side or another. But you have given us this gift in Confessions of an Innocent Man, and like we've talked about, have given us a person and a person's story to invest ourselves in. When did the idea of Rafael and his story come to you?
I think it came to me on about the second death row inmate whose case I worked on that involved an exoneration. I've represented two guys over the years who have been exonerated and gotten out of prison. And both of them have been completely magnanimous when they got out of prison. They said, I'm going to get on with my life. I don't have any bitterness. And they would move on with their lives. And I would stand next to these guys at a press conference where they were talking with such great equanimity. And I would think to myself, boy, that would definitely not be me. If I spent 5 years, 10 years on death row for a crime I didn't commit, I'd be happy to be out, but I would not be so quick to forgive people who I thought were responsible for putting me there. Right. And so I really think that it was sitting next to one of my clients at one of these moments where this idea first buried itself in my brain and just started to develop there without my even knowing it was there. And then when I got to the point in my career where I wanted to write this novel, that story had been developing all these many years without my even knowing it was developing. And I thought, that's going to be the idea of the novel. It's going to be somebody who is an innocent person in prison, but he's not as forgiving as all of these people who I've met in my life as a death penalty lawyer. He's going to be somebody who's a whole lot more like me. And so I just want to explore what that would feel like.
So, when did you got the idea then? When did it actually become a fully formed vision? Okay, this is, I understand the trajectory of the story, and how did it start unfolding for you?
Yes. So what happened was that when I decided I was going to try to write this novel, after this conversation with my agent where we decided I should try to write this novel, I knew how it was going to start and I knew how it was going to end. And I didn't know anything that was going to happen in between. And so I sat down and I'd read these stories. I'd heard these interviews where people who write novels would talk about how they sat down and started writing and the characters just started doing things that they didn't feel like they were a puppeteer pulling strings. They just felt like they were giving words to these behaviors that the characters were initiating of their own volition. And I always thought, these people are crazy. They have a mental illness. These characters don't have any volition. They're just whatever the writer is writing. And then I sat down to write this book and I thought, oh my God, that really does happen. And so I really knew how it was going to start and I knew how it was going to end. But the whole middle, I think, I obviously wrote the book. And so I recognize intellectually that everything that happens is something that I made up. And yet I also feel like the characters in my own head were real. And so I also feel like in some ways what was happening because from the character's point of view, it was the right or truthful thing to happen.
When you had the beginning, the end, and then the characters start coming alive to you. I agree with John Grisham that this book is too short. I kept going, oh my God, I don't want this to end. This story goes at a breakneck pace. And in the best way possible. As you started writing it, did the twists and turns and the character, the choices the characters made, did you ever find yourself stuck, or did the story just keep flowing that way?
I will tell you that the story kept flowing that way. I will tell you what happened that most surprised me. I knew when I sat down to write characters who are on death row, I knew when I sat down to write them. I didn't know how those characters were going to turn out. I didn't know exactly what their final shape was going to be. But I also knew that I was going to like some of them and dislike some of them, because I've met a lot of guys on death row, and some of the guys it sounds weird to say that you could be friends with somebody who committed murder. But some of the guys are guys who I really liked. I got to know well over the years, and I got to like them. And then other guys I just didn't like at all. And I would dread having to go visit them when I would have to go visit them. But I nevertheless had a sense of how the guys who I was going to write about were going to turn out. The people who surprised me were the people who I was creating in a way in the book, who I would have thought going into the book I was not really going to have much sympathy for. I would have felt like going into the book they were going to be hard characters for me to write because they're people in real life who are adversaries of mine. And yet I found when I actually started to write those characters that I developed some sympathy for them as characters that I might not have for them in real life. And I felt like that helped me write those characters in a way that was fully realized and three-dimensional and not caricaturish in any way. And that part of it, I think, really and truly surprised me. There are some people in the book who are based on people in real life, and the people in real life who the characters in the book are based on are people who I just don't like at all. But the book versions of them, I actually kind of do like.
Well, what we discover in writing stories is that whether this person is in a corporate boardroom or a church pulpit or on death row, people are human, and that brings all manner of complications, good and bad, to how we see people, how we interact with them, and how we compare our own actions with the way others behave.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that gets me through the day in this political moment that we're living in, where that at some level is extremely discouraging and demoralizing to me, is one of the things that gets me through the day is I watch people on TV and I think, oh my God, what a detestable human being. How can that person be saying that? What could that person possibly be thinking? But then I'll put the TV on mute and I'll think to myself, okay, that person's a father or a mother, and I bet you that person loves his son or daughter as much as my wife and I love our son. So I try to find that little piece of commonality, that common humanity in everybody. And I think that once you go down the road of trying to do that, in some people, you find that you can do it with everybody. And that once you can do that with everybody, you just don't think of people as two-dimensional anymore. And it makes you more generous, I think, towards people that you really disagree with vehemently about some particular issue.
Right. Confessions of an Innocent Man, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere in hardback, Kindle edition, audiobook. David, this book, is so entertaining, and, you almost kind of cringe when you talk about a death row revenge book being entertaining, but it is one of the best books I've read this year. If people are just discovering you and want to learn more about the work that you do and follow along with what may be coming up next, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yeah, they can go to davidardow.com, and then you can find links to the various clinics and programs that I run, and email address and Twitter handle and all of that stuff.
Great. David, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. It's been a blast. We wish you much success on the book launch.
I appreciate that, Hank. I had a really great time.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
You took a terrible risk tonight.
Why?
You don't know? The first rule.
I was told by a friend that I shouldn't reveal my gift to anyone who doesn't have a gift themselves.
That's exactly right.
Because everyone we tell dies.
Yes, you might have marked me for death.
Made you a target for a ghost. Why can't people know what we can do? What makes it so dangerous? Valerie took up the fireplace prongs and stabbed the logs.
It's called the Great Curse.
Sparks exploded from glowing crevices and drizzled upwards, ricocheting off the black belly of the cauldron, turning into tiny ashes that disappeared up the chimney.
It was cast by a powerful witch over 300 years ago.
Witch? Sorry, but witch? Please, there's no such thing. Valerie closed her eyes. A spoon leapt from Jason's dish and caught him in the temple. He wiped melted ice cream from his cheek. You were saying?
She cast the curse to stop the witch trials.
In Salem? Jason searched his memory.
1692. They burned her alive in the Salem Common. The only witch to be burned.
The cauldron smoked slightly. Its contents had evaporated. A sharp, charred scent filled the room. Wait, said Jason. There were no witches. They were just, victims of religious hysteria, right? So you're saying the witch trials were justified?
Justified? So if a witch did exist, it would be okay to kill her?
No, I just thought... You're right. Never mind.
There was one witch in Salem, at least. A woman with a powerful gift. She only wanted to protect people like us, to give the gifted their anonymity, refuge. She cast the Great Curse as she burned. She proclaimed that mortals who know a witch shall know death. And that is the Great Curse. And it's still in effect after all this time.
Mortal, as in...
Non-gifted. No mortal can know about you, about any authentic witch.
Jason winced. Isn't there another word besides that? She shrugged. So no one can know what I am, what I can do, or else they become a target.
Right. The spirit world will obey the Great Curse and try to kill them.
The spirit world.
The other realm.
Jason rubbed his eyes. How much of this was reality and how much of this was Valerie's nutty brand of mysticism? He felt himself pulling back, as usual, for fear of contagion. He'd spent his whole life reading science fiction. He hated paranormal tales. This was not his genre.